Hey, good evening, guys. Welcome to your bonus hour of GCSE English Literature Paper 2. Specifically today, what we're going to be looking at is unseen poetry. So just one aspect of the course because we've only got an hour. Later on this week, so on Sunday, the night before your exam, rather the day before your exam, we're going to be spending 3 hours on the entirety of this paper, getting a really kind of thorough cram session in. But for today, the focus, just to kind of save anyone asking later on, is going to be on unseen poetry. So let's get started and see what we're doing today. So today's goal, as I just alluded to, is to help you revise for the unseen poetry component of your English literature paper 2, the exam being on Monday. Okay. For those of you who don't know who I am, just a very kind of brief introduction so that you know where all this information is coming from, so you know that you can trust it. So I'm Louis Provis, I'm Head of English here at MyEdspace. I am a fully qualified English teacher with over 10 years of teaching experience in schools all around the country. I have a BA and MA from the University of Cambridge and master's degree from Cambridge, as well as an ongoing PhD in education. On top of that, I have spent the last 9 years working with the various English exam boards, including AQA, EdXL, OCR, and EDUCAS. Specifically, obviously, this session is focused on AQA. Okay, so let's get cracking. So, first of all, can you just give me put a little star into the chat if you are here today? Let's just see who we've got. I can see the chat is starting to take shape. I can see a couple of people are in there. So let's just see how many we've got so we can kind of tailor it. Hopefully, if we have a relatively small number of you in today, we can give more kind of detailed responses to your questions. So let's just get a sense of how many are in here. So I know we've got Mr. Big P, we've got May. Who else have we got in today? We've got Evie, we've got Georgia, Emily. Nice. We've got Cammed Up. Hello. Hello to you. Good to see you. Welcome, welcome. We got Phil. Hello, sir. Hello to you, sir. We got Reese, who is helping us out. We got Catherine, who is helping us out with the modding today, helping you out with any questions that you've got. Nice. So let's get straight into it. So when it comes to unseen poetry for Monday's exam, what is unseen poetry? What is it that makes it easy, and what is it that makes it hard? So into the chat, just share with me your initial thoughts about this aspect of the paper. You've obviously opted into today's course because that's a particular part that you maybe struggle with or that you want some extra kind of support with. So what is it that we do? What is it that is easy about it, and what is it that is hard about it? Just throw some ideas at me in the chat and we can kind of collect them together. So if you've got the workbook downloaded or printed in front of you, you can be taking notes on these as we go as well. So the workbook is for you to fill in. It becomes a fresh revision resource for you, and obviously therefore is quite a valuable thing to be taking away. So any thoughts? Quiet today? That's fine. That's fine. I can take the lead. I've got plenty of things to say about this all of my own. So what is it? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is the key is we've not seen it before. Okay, so it's brand new. Evie has said you don't really need to remember anything, quotes or anything. Okay, so that's one of the things that obviously makes it easier. So there's no memory test, is there? And that's obviously one of those things that a lot of people are really grateful for. There's no test of your memory. You don't need to go in there with any extra knowledge. Understanding the unseen poem, presumably that is something that is difficult, and that's something we can definitely work on today. So understanding as a Key idea to begin with, yes, absolutely. Cammed up, having to do analysis individually is much more difficult, especially when you've never seen the poem before. Yeah, so going straight into analysis, obviously that builds on understanding. Once you've got understanding, you can go straight into analysis. But when you've got a limited time because you've got nothing to say, then that's obviously quite a difficult one. Another thing that makes it hard, Downey's just said, is there's two brand new poems. So not just one that you address in that first section, but two poems that you're going to need to be considering as it goes. So new new is what it is, brand new. You've got nothing to go in with. You haven't got any kind of knowledge to bring straight into the exam. What makes it hard, as you've said, you don't necessarily understand the poem. They do try and provide poems that are I guess easy to get to grips with, at least at a surface level. They're not going to give you something like Tissue, for example, which is, you know, a really difficult poem even to study in depth. They are going to give you something which should be accessible, but yes, understanding can cause a kind of impediment. Analysis is something that we're going to necessarily struggle with if we don't understand the poem first, and then the fact that there are two poems that are going to be coming up rather than just one is obviously an added layer of difficulty. However, what I really want us to focus on is what makes it easy, because the fact that you don't need to go in there with any knowledge kind of pre-recorded is that you can go in with a fresh set of eyes and you can just bring the skills with you. Now, this little acronym is going to be your best friend. Okay, so first is a little acronym that I've come up with, which is going to deal with all of those issues. It's going to give you a route into understanding. It's going to give you something to analyze, and it's going to be something that you can do to both poems so that you'll be in a position to compare them when it comes up to that later. Some of you are also mentioning that the idea of structuring an argument, structuring some kind of an essay, is also something that we struggle with. That's what we're going to look at in today's session. So it's nice to see that we find the same things difficult. So I'm happy with that. A little overview from my perspective as an examiner for the last 9 years, and also from the examiner's reports that I've read enthusiastically, because I'm that guy, and also from kind of discussions that I've had with teachers over the last decade about these particular things. Okay, so what do the questions look like? First things first, you should obviously notice that you've got 24 marks and 8 marks. That's going to be really important to come back to later. Okay, it's going to be really important to come back to later. Now, May's just asking, what does first mean? We're going to come on to that in a minute. It's going to be our little technique, particularly for the first part. So the structure of the question is always going to be, in the first poem, how does the poet present X? So someone was saying a minute ago, wondering what theme to analyze. Well, they tend to give you the theme that they want you to focus on. They're not just going to say, analyze this poem from scratch. They're going to say, analyze this in the poem. So how does the poet present X? And that X is going to be a theme. The second part, which is only 8 marks, and again, I really want you to kind of pay attention to the fact that that's only 8 marks. They will say, in both poem 1 and poem 2, the speakers describe X. Sometimes it's the same theme from the first question. And then they will say, what are the similarities and or differences between the ways the poets present this, and this obviously is X. Okay, so that's the way that they structure these questions. Now, what do the examiners say this year? So in the most recent examiner's report, they have said the following things. So first of all, there is little to no benefit in labeling features without commenting on effects. Now, what do they mean by that? They mean that if people go in and say, this is a sonnet, this is a simile, this is alliteration, this is personification, this is enjambement, whatever they want to kind of show off in terms of terminology, if they're just labeling and not commenting on, they're not going to be getting the marks that they deserve. Okay, so that's the first thing to bear in mind, that if you are going to use any terminology, then it needs to be relevant. So why is it relevant that this is a sonnet? Why is it relevant that they've used enjambement or caesura or whatever it's going to be that you comment on? You need to make sure that that comment is there. Otherwise, you are just showing that you can label things. That is for your annotations. It shouldn't be what you just put into your essay, okay? So anytime you label something, you have to make some kind of a comment on that choice of feature. Another one. There is nothing to be gained from a detached methodical overview of the number of lines, type of rhyme scheme, etc. Again, without comment. Now, what examiners are saying there is they are really bothered by people just saying, they do a first paragraph and they go, this is a 14-line poem known as a sonnet. It has 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet to finish with. Each of the lines is metrically in iambic pentameter, and the punctuation is end stopped, so there's no enjambment. People who do that are not gaining any marks from that. Now, I would love to be able to award marks for that accurate description. However, because it is not analysis, because nobody is digging deeper than that, then it's not something we can actually gain any marks from. Another thing that examiners wanted to point out is that context is not and cannot be assessed on this question, so discussions of the world around the text are unhelpful. So, for example, quite often you will see, let's say it's a poem about Scotland, and then people start talking about kind of Scottish independence, or they start talking about haggis, or like whatever it might be that they already have kind of memorized about Scotland just from, I don't know, their geography or their history studies. Context is not something that you're supposed to be talking about, because you're not expected to know what it is that this poem has been created for. You're just supposed to be getting stuck into the language. Okay, so context, AO3, is not something that you do. Sorry, AO4 is not something that you do. No, it is AO3. That you do in this part of the exam. Okay, and then final bit, and I've already kind of alluded to this, is part 2 responses are often more lengthy and detailed than part 1. Why is that a problem? For those of you tuning into the chat, why is it a problem that people are answering part 2, the comparative part, with more detail than part 1, where you're analysing the first unseen poem? Why is that a problem? Why is that a mistake? Why is it something that examiners are concerned about? Yes, Elaine, you're absolutely right. It's because there aren't as many marks for part 2. So as I've said, as I insisted that we draw attention to, only 8 marks for part 2, which realistically means we should only be spending about a third of the time that we do on part 2 that we spend on part 1. Okay, so my top tips would be: focus on the meanings and effects coming out of any features or quotations you find, not just the features themselves. Okay, so make sure that whenever we analyze something, we comment on its meanings or effects. Maybe you can even comment on the writer's intentions, but anything to do with effect, whether it is put in or something we take out of it, that is what we're focusing on here. Second top tip is going to be starting your treatment of the single text with a thesis or first impressions overview that addresses content and tone. So what that means is, when you find the new poem, you just say something like, this is a poem about whatever it might be with a something tone. Now, a sentence like that, it really creates a sense of understanding of the poem. So that first thing that we do is what we should be, that's the first thing that we should be doing when we get our fresh poem. Now, Myra's just asked, I don't understand how the rhyming scheme won't be gaining any marks. Now, if you can comment on what the rhyme is doing, then you will get marks. So you can get marks if you say the rhyming couplets create a sense of harmony or a sense of completion, or it sounds like a nursery rhyme which creates a sense of kind of chirpiness or cheeriness, or a lack of anticlimax, or whatever it might be. If the rhyme is doing something, then you can use a comment saying the alternate line rhyme or the rhyming couplets. However, if you just say this poem has rhyming couplets or alternate line rhyming or 4-line stanzas or whatever, if you're not explaining why it is effective, why it has been selected, or what impact it can have on you as a reader, what effect it can have on our readings of the poem, then it's not going to gain you marks in that respect. Okay, so everything that we focus on is the writer's craft. What is the writer doing to create things, not just what does this poem contain? Okay, so we're not doing a weighing and measuring approach, we're doing deep analysis, we're going beyond the surface. Okay, so it's not that you won't get marks for commenting on the rhyme scheme, You just need to make sure that there's an actual comment on what it does rather than just what it is. Okay? And then finally, and I've said this 4 times now, the focus needs to be on the part 2. Where's my pen gone? Part 2 needs to be only 8 marks, which means that it needs a light touch approach. You don't go into too much detail for part 2, you just do your comparison and move on. Okay, so for those of you asking, this is kind of the meat and potatoes. This is the core, the reason that we're here today. My acronym FIRST that I invented nearly a decade ago is essentially, it is a cheat sheet. It is a way of ensuring that when you have a brand new poem that you've never seen before, you can still make a comment on it. So even if you have never seen anything like it, you can always comment on each of these things. So in your workbook, you can complete these as we go. So we've got our first and last line. We've got our imagery. We've got repetition. We've got structure. And we've got the title. Okay, so in every single poem that you come across, you will have every single one of these things. So every poem that you come across has a first line and a last line. Otherwise, it's not a poem, is it? So it needs to be arranged in lines or it's not a poem. So you have your first and your last line. Every poem is going to have some degree of imagery in it. Okay, it's going to be painting a picture in the reader's mind in one way or another. Now, quite often, the imagery that is used is going to be figurative language, so personification, similes, metaphors, all of those sorts of things to create imagery, which allows you an opportunity to do what we said a minute ago, which is to use our terminology. We can label something as simile, personification, metaphor, but we make sure that we're commenting on the imagery, i.e. the effect that it creates, the image that it paints in our mind. Repetition, basically, if we have something happening again and again and again, or even just more than once, then we know that it is a significant thing. And we know as readers of this poem that that is something important that the poet has put in there to draw our attention to remain in our heads after we have left the poem. The structure, essentially, if you can show that the poem has been laid out in a certain way as we go through, then we know that we have made a comment on form, structure, and language. And the title, obviously, this comes first. It's at the end of my acronym, but I should really put it up here because it's the thing that we do first. The reason we do it first is because it is the first impression that we get of the poem. Everything that follows is a reflection of that opening. Okay, so the beauty of FIRST is that every single poem that you have has a first and last line, will contain some sort of imagery, will repeat something, even if it's not a word, even if it's ideas. It will be structured in a specific way to create effects, and it will have a title. So in answer to your question, Evie, should all of these things be in the essay? That should be the aim, yeah. So if you can't think of anything to say, you've always got FIRST to fall back on. Okay, so the approach that I like to take is what I call an experiential approach. Okay, so I call it experiential because what we're doing is we are essentially narrating our experience of this poem. Okay, our experience of this poem starts with the title that gives us a first impression. It then gets challenged by the first line of the poem. Is it reinforcing or challenging what you do later on? Is the last line reinforcing or challenging the first impression we get of the poem? What is imagery doing to carry that impression? What final impression are we left with the repetition that's being done? And what has structure added to our understanding the impression that we've gained? Okay, so a couple of questions are coming up already. How many quotes do you recommend for each question? So it's very difficult to say. I would say that with your with the comparison element of the anthology poetry that we'll have done before Unseen, you would need at least one quotation from each poem in each comparative paragraph, and I would say 3 or 4 paragraphs is typically enough. So you're going to need at least 8 quotations in that. When it's your unseen poem, I would say that you should have one or two quotations ideally from each of these things. So you've got first line, last line, imagery, repetition, that's 4, 5, 6. So you've got at least 6 quotations, and then everything else that you comment on top of that. So 6 is your absolute baseline. You should be aiming for more than that. Would this get you top marks? Well, if you do it right, it has ticked all of the boxes that the examiners are looking for. You have zoomed in on every bit of language, every bit of structure, every bit of formal experimentation that's been done by the poet, and therefore it stands you in good stead. As long as what you're saying is valid and interesting and insightful, then you can access those higher marks. This is just a kind of fail-safe. This is something to fall back on if you read a poem and you don't have something instantly to say. So over here is a poem that you've probably never seen before, unless you've, I don't know, looked at this past paper. So this is from a real exam. This is the kind of poem that they might use in an exam. It's quite short, it's quite accessible to give you the first question. So the question, you can see it's there in yellow at the bottom, is how does the poet present the speaker's feelings about the city at night? Okay, so someone was asking earlier, what theme do you focus on? Well, the theme is feelings about the city at night. Okay, and that's what you need to be focusing on as we go through each of these things. So you can be doing this in your work, but you can be annotating with me. This is my base level annotation that I do with every single new poem that I come across. I will apply first to it. Now, I don't necessarily have to limit myself to that. If I have more to say, if there are other things I pick out that don't fit into first, then that's a bonus, right? Flaming Duos, yes, this is the same poem that we looked at in the Easter revision course. What we didn't do in the Easter revision course, obviously because that wasn't AQA specific, is we didn't look at the comparative bit, which we're going to be doing later on in this session. But if you can remember any of the points that we made about that poem, then you're obviously in good stead. So what I do is I apply first. So the first thing I do is I pick out my first and last line. So there's my first line, there's my last line. And I'm going to be thinking about what the relationship is between the first and the last line. I'm then going to be looking for any imagery. So let's read the poem, should we? So the night tinkles like ice in glasses. Leaves are glued to the pavement with frost. The brown air fumes at the shop windows, tries the doors and sidles past. I gulp down winter raw. The heady darkness swirls with tenements. In a brown fuzz of cotton wool, lamps fade up crags, die into pits. Frost in my lungs is harsh as leaves scraped up on paths. I look up, there, a high roof sails at the masthead, fluttering a grey and ragged star. The world's a bear shrugged in his den. It's snug and close in the snoring night. And outside, like chrysanthemums, the fog unfolds its bitter scent. Okay, so the first and the last lines I've already got here. My imagery, I've got to say, the one that I really liked was the world's a bear shrugged in his den. So I'm going to use that as my imagery. Any repetition, so it's not actually repeated, but there's lots of things to do with the cold. So I'm just going to link those, even though they're not technically repetition of a single word. They are still linked in one way or another. So we've got ice, frost. Frost we do have actually repeated, and winter raw. Now, if we have words that are all they're not the same as each other, but are in the same category as each other, does anybody know what we call that? Because it's not repetition if it's not the exact same word, but it is similar to repetition. Words are in the same category. What do we call that? I imagine you would have come across it in your English lessons throughout your time at school. What do we call that? Throw it into the chat if you think you know. Would that be a semantic field? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so Elaine, you're also right, but you've spelled it right. So semantic field to do with semantics, which is meaning. So words that all mean similar things. Okay. Yeah. So lots of us are mentioning semantic field, semantic field, semantic field. Yeah. Well done, guys. You're absolutely right. So that is going to be my repetition. So that's going to be my R. My structure. Well, it's in 4 equally lengthed stanzas. They are 4 lines each, which we call a quatrain. Now notice how I'm just putting this up here in brackets out of the way for my structure, because I don't know whether it's worth commenting on yet. Because as we said earlier, if the structure is doing something, then we need to comment on it. If the structure isn't adding anything to our understanding, then we don't need to mention it. Okay? So that's our S, and then our title, which is the first thing that we actually saw, is November Night, Edinburgh. Okay? So that's my baseline of annotation. I literally just highlight or circle the quotes that I'm going to use in my main response. Now, my main response may end up adding quotations from elsewhere in the poem, but I need to make sure that I include at least all of these. So I've got obviously the, what is it, 6, 7, 8, 9, yeah, about 10 quotations I've ended up picking out here. So I'm going to use all of those in my write-up. But let's take them one at a time and think about the effect, okay? So if we start with our title, November Night, Edinburgh, okay? So the first thing that I'm going to draw attention to is the fact that November night, if it's November and it's nighttime, I'm expecting it to be cold, okay? So we're expecting certain things as readers, that this is going to be cold because it's November, which is winter time. It's at night time, which is where the sun goes away, therefore it's cold. And Edinburgh, obviously it's going to be, well, that's Scottish, okay? It's also a capital city, which could mean that it's going to be bustling, you know, busy. All of those things I might expect from the opening, which is what the title gives us. So the first impression is it's going to be cold. Is it going to be bustling? Is it going to be kind of busy or quiet? Because it's nighttime, which is quiet, but also it's in a big city. The capital of Scotland is obviously Edinburgh, so it's going to be a busy place. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the Norman McCraig. I don't think that's it. We don't know anything about the poet, so we can just ignore it. In fact, I'm just going to draw a line through it so we can forget about that until we potentially use his name in the in the piece itself. Okay, so that's my first impression. My first impression from the poem itself: the night tinkles like ice in glasses. Ooh, so that makes it sound really great word here. Opulent. I apologize for my handwriting. I am using a scribble pad on here. Opulent. I'm going to write it better down here. Opulent. Gives a sense of opulence, i.e. there is wealth and class here. If it's tinkling like ice in glasses, then that kind of metaphor that we start the poem with is a sense of opulence. It's like it's the kind of thing that you'd expect at a party, wouldn't you? The tinkling of glasses is the kind of sound you expect from a party. If we then just skip straight to the end, so opulent, opulent is basically rich and fancy and posh. Amrita, I really like your idea. Could you say the night is momentary, as ice also is due to it melting? Yeah. So the word that we might use for that instead of momentary is what we would call ephemeral. Now, ephemeral basically means temporary. It disappears. Okay. So yeah, we could definitely comment on the ephemeral nature of night because it is starting to melt. Thanks, Ian. I've been practicing my writing. Appreciate the props there. Okay, so let's go to the end of the poem. The night tinkles like ice in glasses, suggesting opulence, maybe ephemeral things. Dum 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 dum. The fog unfolds its bitter scent. Oh dear, things have gone downhill. Okay, so it's a sad ending. So if we start with a happy beginning and we have a sad ending, we've obviously had a big decline in the tone. So a decline in the tone is obviously really significant because we start the poem, the night tinkles like ice in glasses, with that kind of, I might actually comment on the that kind of cheery verb that we've got there of tinkles. opulence like ice in glasses, yeah? So like a party, but by the end, we've got the fog unfolds its bitter scent. It's sad, it's nasty. There's been a decline in tone, and so you could say, yeah, the start contrasts with the end, as Cam's just said, yeah. So you could use that word contrast. So there's been a decline in tone. You could say, you could use that word contrast. Absolutely. Um, You could call it a volta. Yeah, it's a great word, suggesting we've got a change in the tone of the poem. But I would say a volta would only really apply if the whole poem has been cheery and it only changes at the end. Whereas I would say that the volta would come much sooner than this because it's only really the first line which has that positivity. So um, let's go to our next one in first, which is imagery. The world a bear shrugged in his den. I love this one. So what do we call it when we've turned something into an animal? Starting with a Z, we've made something animal-like. Who's going to bring in there? It's a really cool word that you can use. It's kind of the opposite of personification where you make things human. If you make things more animal-like, we call it Z. What's it going to be? Zoomorphism. Nice one, Elaine. You're absolutely right. Zoomorphism going on here. So we've got this zoomorphic. Um, nice. Well done. Yeah, well done, Maya. Well done, May. You're absolutely right. Zoomorphism. Okay. So zoomorphism. That's not the worst handwriting ever, actually. That's pretty good. Okay, so we've got our zoomorphism there. And what is it actually saying? So I don't want to fall into that trap that I mentioned earlier of just saying zoomorphism. Well done, Ayan. Yeah, you got it. I don't want to just say zoomorphism and leave it at that because that would be feature spotting. That would be labeling for the sake of labeling. I need to comment on it. So what is significant about the world being a bear shrugged in its den? Well, if the world is big, right? There's the world. Majestic art. A bear is obviously small. Okay, there's my bear. Let's give him some ears. Right, so we're going down in size there. However, compared with people, a bear is massive. Now, obviously, these aren't to scale because that would be a terrifying bear if it was that size. But you can see a descent in scale. So the world is this big thing. It's being made to seem like a smaller thing, but that small thing is still bigger than humans. So the point being that bears are supposed to be kind of big and powerful, but this particular bear is shrugged in his den. Shrugged meaning that he has shrugged, i.e. lifted his shoulders up because of the cold, and he's also put himself into his den for kind of ensconcing himself, getting that kind of safety away from the cold. So, so the cold is obviously powerful if it's making something as big as the world and as powerful as a bear seems small and, like Evie just said, seeking out hibernation, escaping from the winter. If the world is escaping from winter, going into hibernation, seeking solace, seeking safety, it means that the cold is really powerful. It's more powerful than the world, right? The biggest thing that most people can imagine, certainly at a young age, is the world, and in this case, it has been made to seem small and weak and retreating because of how oppressive the cold is. So the cold is powerful, and I'm also going to use that word oppressive because I think that would be potentially a good one to use in my essay. Sorry about my spelling, my handwriting again. It has briefly improved, and now it's falling off a cliff again. Amrita, nature is superior to making. What do you mean by making? Oh, mankind, perhaps. Yeah, nature is superior to mankind would it be a beautiful sentence? Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, you corrected it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's going to be my imagery. The repetition, well, we've just got ice, frost, frost, winter. I don't really need to add anything to that except it's cold, and the cold is, well, it's everywhere. Okay, so the cold is everywhere. It is therefore, what word could we use instead of everywhere? I'm running out of space on here, and I'm sure some of you are going to put it in before I do. Omnipresent, we could say, or we could even use this really wicked word for everywhere, which is Ubiquitous. Ubiquitous literally means everywhere. So if something is ubiquitous, it means it comes up all the time, really frequently. So ubiquitous is a really cool word that you can use. Anytime you've got repetition, you could use that word about it being ubiquitous because the poet has put it into the poem that many times. That's a really fancy way of showing off that you understand the writer's craft, because the writer, in this case Norman McCraig, has made it ubiquitous, that cold. The cold is everywhere, you can't escape it, even the world is trying to hide from it. Boom, can you see we're starting to form an argument? Literally, we haven't looked at any of the other quotes from the poem. We've literally just looked at the ones that we have highlighted. Okay, now what can we say about that structure point that we put up here? The 4 quatrains. Well, is there anything to comment on? Is there any rhyme in there? Glasses, frost, windows past, heady, tenements, cotton wool pits, leaves there, head, star, den, night, chrysanthemums, scent. So there's no rhyme anywhere. Maybe we could comment on that. So we could potentially comment on there's no rhyme, perhaps suggesting what? What is the absence in, what's the absence of rhyme achieving? Uh, can, yeah, a word for everything in English. Yeah, we can always find new cool words for ideas that we've spotted in the past. And yeah, we can keep on adding them to our collection so we can show off them. So Amrita, you could call it free verse, yeah? So India, yeah, you're absolutely right. So free verse. Um, that's a labeling technique, though. What does it do? Cam is suggesting chaos. Interesting. So the lack of rhyme and the lack of clear structure, so that free verse thing, might suggest chaos. I like that. Yeah, it's a really nice idea. So we could maybe use that word chaos. It's barely fitting onto my screen. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that says chaos up there if you can't read it. Cam, you could also say, yeah, unstructured equals a lack of control. Shows the separation at night. Interesting idea, mate. Evie, could I use ubiquitous in a sentence? Yes, absolutely. So I could say, due to the repetition of frost and words in the semantic field of winter, like ice and winter, or the semantic field of cold, like ice and winter, it comes across that this bad weather is ubiquitous. So ubiquitous is an adjective to mean omnipresent or everywhere. Okay, so I know everywhere is technically an adverb, but in this case, ubiquitous as an adjective is describing how frequently found something is. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. India, yeah, unpredictable. So that lack of rhyming makes it unpredictable, perhaps like the weather. Now we're onto something. Now we can actually use our lack of rhyme and our lack of clear structure to actually make a point. So I really like those responses that you've given. You guys are smashing it. Really like those. And can you see that we've only spent about kind of 10 minutes and that's with lots of talking. This would only take about 2 or 3 minutes. And we've got a really densely annotated poem, but I haven't needed to refer to anything else in the poem other than first. So I've only referred to the first and the last line, one piece of imagery, my repetition, and my title, and I'm making now a brief comment on structure. So the beauty the beauty of first is it allows you to get a really clear sense of a poem without actually having to kind of densely annotate the entire thing, every single word choice, only the things that we think are going to be really powerful. Now, what we could then do is potentially go, I don't know if this is going to fill a whole essay. I'm also going to comment on this, this, and this, and you can add them on top of first. So first is your foundation on which you build. Ian has just said, are there any other line structures other than quatrain? Yes, absolutely. So you can have obviously couplet, we've mentioned before, that's 2. You can have sestet and tercet, and yeah, so there's names for kind of all of those combinations. I wouldn't get too het up on kind of memorizing a bunch of them, because like I said, if you can't make any comment on it, then it's not valid. If you sit there in the exam going, what's a 4-line stanza called, and you sit there wasting time, you're missing out on the opportunity to say something about the 4-line structure. So it's much better to say the 4-line structure does X, Y, and Z rather than sitting there for ages and going, this is a quatrain and leaving it at that. Okay, so if you can't remember a specific piece of terminology, just have something in place of it and move on with the actual comment on it, because that's the key thing there. What can you say for the effect of line structures? Well, in this case, you could. The thing is, at this point, we're not really going to need much more to fill an essay, but we could comment on the fact that the vast majority of the lines are what we call end stopped. So if you look, there's a full stop at the end of most sentences. And it's only at particular points in the poem where you have caesura, so you have a kind of stop in the middle of a line, or you have enjambement, where you go at the end of one line straight onto the next without a full stop. And you can potentially comment on anytime you lose the end stop, it suggests a lack of control. So an end stop is really rigid, isn't it? It's really kind of clear. So you have start, end, full stop. And then in the moments where you have some caesura, where you have some enjambement, in those moments you can go, so there is a lack here of stability, there is a lack of predictability, there is a lack of structure. That's when you might comment on the structure of the lines, and that would be potentially a good thing to say. So we do our annotation just on first, and we add anything else that we want to, and then we just turn it into an essay. Now, we're not necessarily going to write this essay. I don't think that's necessarily the most valuable use of your time. You can do that with I think you've got this in your workbooks. You can do this in your own time to have a practice at putting it into words, because I've created some sentence structures for you. But essentially all you do is you just slot in your ideas. So you start with the title up at the top. We're first introduced to this poem by its title, and then you put obviously in the title of November Night, Edinburgh, giving us the first impression of, and then what is it that title does. Maliha, does this finish at 5? Yes, it does. If you've got somewhere else to go, if you've got maths, for example, then yes, at 5 o'clock we will be done at 5 on the dot. I'm going to make some time for some Q&A at the end as well. Evie, would each of these be a paragraph? I mean, potentially. The way that I've done it is just so that each one of them is a sentence. Now, you can obviously have one sentence paragraphs, but it's not necessarily enough for a paragraph unless you're adding extra detail to these things. So it could be what paragraph, or you could combine a few of them, like the title and first line, for example, for your first impressions, the last line and the imagery is another paragraph. So you can kind of combine them together. Camdop's put a nice point on there. The mix of enjambment, yeah, so it's an A, enjambment, and end stop line goes well with the absent rhyme scheme, suggesting a lack of control over the weather and day and night. Yeah, absolutely. So that's exactly the kind of thing that you want to be saying when it comes to actually making a comment on what the language is doing. So we can say enjambment, we can say end stop, we can say caesura, but if we're not making a beautiful comment like that one can, then there's no point in saying it. So that's what we're looking for. Great job. So you can fill this in your own time. You might find that it is enough for an essay, depending on how much detail you want to go into with your analysing each of these, the quotes that you've picked out. Or you might find that you want to add some of the extra comments that you annotated as you were going through. So you use first. Technically, it's T furs, right? Rather than first, but that's only because the title comes first when you're reading it. Okay. How do you link it to the question? Yeah, lovely point. Thank you so much for asking that, Evie. You will notice that the question asks about the city at night, wasn't it? Let's just have a quick check of the question. How does the poet present the speaker's feelings about the city at night? Yes. So what you would do is you would just, in that first sentence that I've got here, we're first introduced to the poem by its title, November Night, Edinburgh, giving us the first impression of the city at night as somewhere that blah blah blah. Okay, so it's you would just slot it into your points there. So it's first impression of the city at night as somewhere that I don't know is bustling, is cold, is whatever. Okay, first impression. That first impression is reinforced by the opening line of the poem. Um, the night tinkles like ice in glasses, suggesting that the city at night, and again you just put the city at night, is blah 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 blah, and you make your comment. So um, Samir's just said unseen poetry is so hard. It can be, but the beauty of this whole of this approach is that you've always got something to say about each aspect of first. And if you use a structure where you just go, the title does this to me, the first line does this to me, by the end of the poem we have this, that is carried throughout by the imagery, this is reinforced by the structure. Then essentially you've ticked all of those boxes and you've said something without really having, you don't even necessarily have to understand the poem as a whole. You can literally go straight in and just go, the title makes me think this. And even if you don't know what the poem is about, you can at least comment on the words of the title. If you take the first line and you go, well, I still don't know what the poem is about, but this first line makes me think blah, then that's a valid point. And as long as you're doing your focus, then you're all good. Okay. Cool. So hopefully that makes sense. The second part, right, does this. It brings up a second poem and it says, um, sorry, some people are adding some comments. How many paragraphs do you recommend? Um, it's hard to say. If you're just following first, and you're doing your quotation, you're explaining the quotation, you're zooming in on some language, then each of those can be a paragraph, and so you would have what? So FIRST. You could have 5 relatively short paragraphs, or you could have a paragraph about like the first part of the poem, which is quite a long paragraph, the middle of the poem, for the structure and the imagery, and then the end of the poem. If you so you might have 3 longer paragraphs. Depends entirely on the approach that you take to it and how you group together those aspects of first, and if you indeed wanted to add in some extra details. Yeah. Now the second part, it's only 8 marks, which is why we've left so little time for it. It's not because I'm bad at timekeeping, it's because it's much less important to spend as much time on it. So you get the original poem and you get a second poem. They talk about attitudes towards the city at night, so it's the same theme that we had in the first question, and then it asks you for similarities and or differences between the methods and those attitudes. Okay. For those of you worrying about your grades, there's nothing to be done now for kind of getting back paper 1. I'm sure it didn't go as badly as you thought it did. You still have plenty of opportunity to kind of rescue it with paper 2, which is why you're here tonight. So let's stay focused on this for now. We can share our woes during the Q&A at the end. Let's just have a quick look at what we do for this one. Okay, so essentially our approach to this should be to PP. Okay, so PP or indeed Lili. I prefer Lili over PP because number one, P is kind of gross, but also Lili gives us an opportunity to link. Okay, so our link is our synthesis. It's where we basically say what it is we're comparing in the 2 poems. Okay, so let's say for example, let's find one where we've got the city is squalid and sinister from this new poem, and let's have the brown air fumes at the shop windows, tries the doors and sidles past. Okay, so the brown air fumes. So in both of these examples, we've got personification being used, haven't we? Personification to create, let's say, bad vibes. Yeah. Guys, I know some of you are sharing your experiences of paper one, but if we could bring it back to this just for the remaining 10 minutes, um, let's just hold on to those thoughts until the end, because this is obviously it's only 8 marks, but they're still important 8 marks. So my link or synthesis, I'm going to refer to the question, as Cam has just mentioned, the RTQ refer to question, but I'm also going to make sure that I'm making a link between the two of them. So I'm going to say, well, this is obviously a similarity, isn't it? So I would say, one similarity, and now I need to refer to the question, in how they present the city is their focus on its nastiness. Yeah, okay, so that would be absolutely fine. That would be our kind of our L sentence. Then we go straight into our E, which is evidence from poem 1. So in November night, then we quote the brown air fumes, and I'm skipping out a bit there, so I'm just going to put it in square brackets. Tries the doors, suggesting blah blah blah, and then obviously that's the end of that one. And then we just do the same thing for the second poem. So one similarity in how they present the city in their is their focus on its nastiness. Then you go into E, which is your evidence from the first poem. In November night, Edinburgh, the brown air fumes tries the doors, and then we do our E, which is our explanation of what's going on there, suggesting that, the personification suggesting that it is out to get them. And then we do our link to the second one, which is similarly in a London thoroughfare, we have the city is squalid and sinister, suggesting that it is challenging things. Okay, so we can be really brief on that. We can literally do pretty much 3 sentences per point. There is no recommendation of how many lilies you do. If you are kind of more detailed, some people they might get kind of 5 marks for 1 lily. I would say a minimum of 2 links. You know, aim for 3, but if you're being nice and detailed and you're analyzing the differences and comparing thoroughly, don't feel like you need to cover a certain number of links. So as an examiner, I can tell you that on no occasions have I had to limit the marks if it's really good comparative analysis. If they've done only 2 lilies. If they've done more, sometimes they lose any kind of detail. They just go, in this poem, it's sad. It's also sad in this poem, quote, quote, and move on. They've done that like 4 times. Those people usually still only get kind of 6 marks. Whereas if you have a kind of a clear Lily structure where you have your overview synthesis, you quote and explain, and then you move on to the next one, you usually have time for 2, even if you've only got those 8 marks and limited time at the end of the exam. I would still aim for kind of 2 complete lilies where you do include the that second E for each of them, the kind of the explanation. Okay, hopefully that has been useful. That's why we would write it. So look, it's me. Unseen Poetry Q&A. Now is your remaining 5 minutes to ask any other questions about Unseen Poetry. So there's one straight away from Ali. So Lily is your link, your evidence, your explanation, and then you just do that twice. So 1 for each poem. Okay. So link, evidence, explain. Yeah. Now the link, obviously, when it's halfway through, you're going to use some kind of comparative language. So the first link is kind of synthesis, and the second link is a kind of connecting word, a connecting adverb. between the two poems on that second Lily. Yeah. Any other questions? Um, Mr. Big P, how can I be just as handsome as you? Well, I mean, it's quite easy. You wake up um, looking like this, and it's quite depressing to look in the mirror. But you get through. That is how you can be just as handsome as me. Great question. Any others? Any other questions about unseen poetry? Ideally, what else? Was that the only question we had? So either that means that I've been really clear and thorough about how to do unseen poetry, or it means that the only thing that we've been looking at is my ugly mug and not focusing on what we've been doing. Any thoughts? What's my gym split, bro? Again, it's all the muscles all the time, every day. It's just the only way, mate. Um, any actual questions? Any questions about unseen poetry by any chance? What we're saying? How can we revise it? You can't revise it because it's not a knowledge-based one. The only thing you can do is practice it. So I would take existing poems. You can go onto the AQA website and find past papers. Um, on Sunday, obviously, we're going to be doing the cram course where we'll have 3 hours and we can spread it out throughout the various questions. Um, how do we mark in English? So we're given a specific question. Typically, what will be given is a specific question on the exam. So for me, it might be unseen poetry. Um, and um, we will have the paper in front of us. There'll be no names or anything on it. We won't know the handwriting because it won't be someone we've taught before. And then we'll have a mark scheme alongside it that will say, if they're doing this, this, and this, you can award this many marks. Here is an example of a really good one you can compare it to. This would get 8 marks. This might get 4 marks. How does it relate to these two? So that's kind of the sort of the way that it works. Um, Elaine, do you need to do multiple methods per quote? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Could you rephrase the question? Um, Maya, I always lose marks because I don't think it's sophisticated enough with vocabulary. To be honest, I wouldn't focus too much on being sophisticated with your language for this question, simply because you're not getting any AO4 marks. So don't worry too much about the expression. Just focus on being really clear um, and um, and kind of um, talking about the effects of language um, rather than just those language terminology bits. Yeah. Um, what are the type of poems? Again, I wouldn't worry too much about that. You can have your sonnets and your ballads and your haikus and your limericks, but the form really doesn't make much of a difference to what you say about it. Lots of you wishing each other luck on exams. That's really nice. Inshallah, we pass every subject with amazing grades. Absolutely. Um, Oh, someone's talking about Ari. Elaine, if a quote has both a simile and a verb to analyze, should you do both if they link to a similar point? Yeah, so what you might do, you could say in the simile quote, like the full quote, the verb, and then zoom in on that verb, creates the impression, blah, blah, blah. So if it has got both of them, so you can kind of slot those bits of terminology in, or you can just focus on the bit that's relevant. So if the simile is relevant, then focus on the effect of the simile. If the verb choice is the relevant thing, you can just focus on that, or you can combine. That's absolutely fine. Um, Better not be too many moles on the paper. I haven't revised that properly. I have no idea what you're talking about with some of these, but I am going to let you go. If there are no more questions on unseen poetry, I will let you all go. I know some of you have got, well, obviously lots of you have got exams tomorrow. Some of you have got another session this evening, so I will let you crack on. But thank you so much for your time today. You've been absolutely amazing. Hopefully there's been something in there that is useful to you that you can take away and you can apply. On Monday. I really hope to see all of you back on Sunday as well. We're going to go through the whole paper in lots of detail. You're going to see examples, like fully written examples of full mark responses that we can see how to actually get there. Okay. So I will pray for you. Of course I will. Yeah, I'll pray for all of you. Good luck. You'll be amazing. You're clearly really bright students, and you've done the right thing in coming here tonight just to kind of reinforce that understanding and reassure you that you're doing great things. So good luck, and I will see you on Sunday, hopefully. See you later.